The brutality of the cartel, the true face of human trafficking. They weren't just criminals, they weren't just smugglers, they were butchers, and human lives were nothing more than commodities to them. The Sinaloa Cartel, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and Los Zetas, these weren't just names whispered in fear along the US-Mexico border. They were empires built on blood, thriving on the suffering of those too weak, too desperate, or too poor to fight back. For them, human trafficking wasn't just about sneaking people across the border. No, that was just the beginning. They sorted their victims like livestock, choosing who lived and who died based on profit margins. Young women and girls, they were funneled into cartel-run brothels, sold to the highest bidder. If they tried to resist, they were brutalized into submission. The ones who became too broken to be of use, buried in the desert, nameless and forgotten. Strong men? Forced into slave labor on drug farms, where they were made to harvest coca leaves and opium poppies under armed guard. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they were executed on the spot, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. Children, the most valuable assets of all. Some were trained to be child soldiers, turned into cartel assassins before they even turned 15. Others were sold for black market organ harvesting, their tiny bodies never meant to be found. And then there were those who weren't useful enough. The elderly, the sick, the injured, they simply disappeared. Cartel enforcers dumped them in mass graves or used them as live training dummies for new recruits. This wasn't just crime. This was industrialized suffering. Inside the warehouse, the stench of sweat, urine, and death was suffocating. The cages weren't even big enough for the people to stand. They were packed together like animals, some of them too weak to lift their heads. In one corner, a woman lay motionless, her eyes open but vacant. She wasn't dead. Not yet, but she was close. Near her, a young girl, no older than 14, huddled against the bars, clutching her knees to her chest. Her face was swollen, bruises blooming across her skin like rotting flowers. A man with whip marks across his back sat beside her, his arms wrapped protectively around a boy no older than 10. The boy was crying. The man whispered something, words of comfort that meant nothing in a place like this, because they all knew what was coming. Not everyone in these cages would make it out alive. Some of them had already been promised to buyers. A cartel enforcer, a monster with dead eyes, walked past the cages, a clipboard in his hand. He pointed at the teenage girl. "She's next," he grunted to another man. The girl screamed, pressing herself against the bars. The man beside her, her father, grabbed the bars, shaking them violently. "No, please, take me instead," he begged. The enforcer didn't even look at him. He just laughed. "You're already sold," he said. "We need workers for the new fields. You'll be picking coca leaves in Sonora by tomorrow." The father screamed as they dragged his daughter away. The boy clutched his arm, sobbing, but there was nothing he could do. Because in this place, in this hell, begging didn't work. Here, only money and power mattered. Why did the cartel do this? Because it was good business. Human trafficking made them billions. A kilo of cocaine, it could only be sold once. But a human being, a woman, could be sold over and over in cartel-controlled brothels. A farm worker could be worked to death and replaced within hours. A child could be turned into a killer or a corpse, whichever made more money first. And no one would stop them. Because who would dare? The police bought. The politicians bought. The system rotten to the core. The only ones who ever tried to stop them were people like Ethan Cole. People who believed that human life should not have a price tag. People who were willing to risk everything to put these monsters in the ground. Who is Ethan Cole? Ethan Cole was a man built for war. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a man of words. He was a soldier. A hunter. A former Marine. Ethan had spent years fighting in places where laws didn't exist, where life and death were separated by nothing more than the pull of a trigger. After leaving the military, he didn't walk away from the fight. He joined a special operations task force, one that didn't officially exist. Their mission? To hunt the worst kind of criminals, not drug dealers, not small-time gangsters. The real monsters, human traffickers, the kind of men who sold lives for profit, who stole children from playgrounds and turned them into products. Ethan had seen it firsthand. Women chained to walls like animals, men worked to death in cartel-run drug farms, boys turned into killers before they could even shave. It made him sick, and it made him ruthless. Ethan had stopped believing in rules a long time ago. The only thing that mattered now? Stopping the monsters. No matter the cost. Who is Shadow? Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a warrior, a canine bred for battle, trained to track, attack, and survive in the deadliest situations. A Belgian Malinois, Shadow had served alongside Ethan for 3 years. Together, they had saved lives, taken down traffickers, and fought in places so dark that only men like them could survive. Shadow wasn't just Ethan's partner. He was his brother. Where Ethan went, Shadow followed. Where Shadow led, Ethan trusted. And if there was one thing Shadow knew, one thing written into his very soul, it was that he would die for Ethan. Without hesitation, without fear. Because that's what heroes do. The intelligence had been clear. The Sinaloa cartel had turned an abandoned warehouse near the US-Mexico border into a human trafficking hub. This wasn't just some small-time smuggling ring. It was a processing center, a place where traffic victims were sorted and sold like cattle. Women and girls? Sent to cartel-run brothels across North America. Strong men? Shipped to drug farms in the jungle where they would work until they dropped dead. Children? Sold to the highest bidder for purposes too horrific to speak of. And those who weren't valuable enough? Buried in mass graves. The mission was simple. Get in, save the victims, kill the traffickers, burn the whole thing down. Ethan had done this before. But this time, something was different. The desert night was silent, but Ethan's instincts told him violence was near. Shadow moved at his side, his muscles tense, his ears perked. Ethan's team, a squad of elite operators, moved like ghosts through the shadows, their weapons locked and loaded. The warehouse stood ahead of them, a black mass against the horizon. Ethan's radio crackled. Alpha team, move in, game on. With a flick of his hand, Ethan gave Shadow the signal. The dog bolted forward, nose to the ground, leading the way. A heartbeat later, the first gunshot rang out. The next 60 seconds were pure chaos. Gunfire erupted. Cartel enforcers came pouring out of the warehouse like rats from a burning ship. Shadow struck first. The first cartel soldier never saw him coming. 1 second, he was raising his rifle. The next, Shadow's teeth clamped onto his arm. The man screamed, trying to shake the dog off, but it was already too late. Shadow ripped him to the ground, dragging him like a rag doll. Pop! A bullet from Ethan's rifle ended the cartel member's life. But there was no time to stop. More enemies were coming. And inside that warehouse, people were still trapped. Ethan moved forward, his heart hammering, his focus razor sharp. And that was when he saw it. The cages. There were dozens of them. Rusting metal cages, packed with human beings. Men, women, children, all crammed together like animals. Some of them were moving. Dead? Unconscious? Ethan didn't know. A woman with hollow eyes looked up at him. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was so weak, so broken. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Rodriguez, get these people out. We'll cover you." But before anyone could move, a door at the back of the warehouse burst open. And then the real nightmare began. The cartel enforcers weren't retreating. They were burning everything down. A Molotov cocktail sailed through the air. Crash! Flames erupted instantly, licking at the cages. The prisoners inside screamed, their bodies pressed against the bars, trying to escape. A boy no older than 10 grabbed the bars, his tiny hands burning on contact. His screams ripped through the night. Ethan moved to save him. And then, the worst thing happened. The cartel was losing. They were desperate. A gunman in the shadows raised his pistol. He wasn't aiming at Ethan. He was aiming at Shadow. Bang! The sound was like a sledgehammer to Ethan's chest. He turned just in time to see his best friend collapse. Blood pooled beneath Shadow's body. For a split second, the world went silent. Then Shadow whimpered. A small, weak sound, like he didn't understand why Ethan wasn't helping him. Ethan fell to his knees, hands pressing against Shadow's wound. "Stay with me, buddy. Stay with me." Shadow's tail thumped once, then it stopped. Ethan's radio crackled. No canine medical support available. Budget cuts. Budget cuts. They had just let Shadow die. And something inside Ethan snapped. The system had failed. The government had failed. They had let monsters rule while treating heroes like trash. Ethan wasn't just angry. He was done. As the flames roared behind him, as cartel enforcers begged for mercy, Ethan made a decision. One that would change everything. He was going to burn the entire system to the ground. The smell of blood and burning flesh filled the air. Ethan knelt beside Shadow's motionless body, his hands trembling, coated in his best friend's blood. His radio crackled in his earpiece. "Cole, what's your status? Do you copy?" He didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because something inside him was gone. Something had snapped. The system had failed him. They had trained Shadow. They had used him as a weapon, made him risk his life to fight their wars, and when the moment came to save him, they refused. Budget cuts. That was all Shadow's life had been worth to them. A line in an expense report, and now he was dead. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Rage, hotter than the fire engulfing the warehouse, boiled inside him. He looked up. The cartel enforcer who had pulled the trigger was still there, crawling away, clutching a gunshot wound to his leg. Ethan's heart should have been racing. But it wasn't. It was steady, cold, calculated. He stood up slowly, walking toward the man like a storm rolling in. The enforcer turned, eyes wide with terror. "Please." Ethan didn't hesitate. The gunshot echoed through the night. The man collapsed, lifeless. Ethan didn't even blink. There was no mercy left in him. A scream snapped Ethan out of his trance. The prisoners. The warehouse was burning, and people were still trapped inside. Ethan grabbed his radio. "All units, fall back. Get the civilians out, now." The team moved fast, pulling survivors from the flames. Ethan rushed into the smoke, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Heat pressed against his skin, sweat rolling down his face. A young girl no older than 10 was curled in the corner of a cage, too terrified to move. "I got you," Ethan whispered, his voice softer than it had been in years. She looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. He reached in and lifted her into his arms. The building groaned. The flames were eating through the structure. They were out of time. Ethan ran, faster than he ever had before. The roof collapsed just as he cleared the doorway. The entire warehouse came crashing down behind him. But they had made it. The girl clung to his vest, sobbing. Ethan looked around at the survivors, battered, broken, but alive. At least they had made it. But Shadow hadn't, and Ethan knew he would never be the same. Hours later, Ethan stood in the field outside the wreckage, staring at Shadow's covered body. The medics had arrived, so had the higher-ups, the politicians, the men in suits. They weren't here for justice. They were here for damage control. A general approached him. His voice was flat, emotionless. "You did your job, Cole. Be proud." Ethan said nothing. "I'll see what we can do about giving your dog a mention in the report." That was when Ethan's vision went red. A mention? Shadow had given his life. He had saved Ethan, saved the civilians. And this bastard was offering a mention? Ethan snapped. His fist connected with the general's jaw before he could think. The man hit the ground hard, clutching his bleeding lip. The entire camp went silent. Ethan didn't care. He turned to leave. And he knew exactly what he had to do next. Expose everything. Burn the system to the ground. What happens when justice is nothing but a lie? What happens when the system that swore to protect the innocent is the same system that lets monsters walk free? What do you do when the only thing left to believe in is vengeance? Ethan Cole had spent his entire career fighting for justice. But after what happened to Shadow, after watching his partner bleed out in his arms, knowing that the system had let him die, something inside him had changed forever. This wasn't about following orders anymore. This was about burning the whole damn system down. Ethan sat in a sterile interrogation room, the overhead light buzzing faintly. He wasn't under arrest, but he might as well have been. Across the table sat Major William Carter, a Pentagon official who had been assigned to handle the fallout from the cartel warehouse raid. "What happened out there, Cole?" Carter's voice was calm, too calm. Ethan didn't answer. "You disobeyed direct orders. You abandoned protocol, and then," Carter leaned in, his cold blue eyes narrowing, "you executed an unarmed cartel enforcer." Ethan met his gaze without blinking. "He shot my partner." Carter sighed, shaking his head. "Your partner was a dog." Crack. The chair slammed against the wall as Ethan lunged across the table, grabbing Carter by the collar. "Say that again," Ethan growled. "I dare you." Two MPs burst into the room, guns drawn, shouting at Ethan to stand down. Slowly he let go. But the rage in his eyes didn't fade. Carter adjusted his tie, brushing himself off like nothing had happened. "I get it," he said. "You're upset, but the world doesn't stop for dead dogs, Cole." Ethan's knuckles turned white. Carter leaned forward. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop this. You're going to sign this NDA and you're going to walk away. The Sinaloa cartel is off limits, understood? Ethan stared at the paper in front of him. A gag order. They were burying the truth. They were protecting the cartel. And that was when Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't just about a corrupt government. This was a cover-up. Someone high up was working with the cartels. And they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because Ethan wasn't walking away. That night, Ethan sat in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of El Paso, staring at the bottle of whiskey on the table. Next to it was a USB drive. Rodriguez had smuggled it to him before they shut down the investigation. Inside that drive was proof. Proof that the government had known about the cartel trafficking ring for years. Proof that high-ranking officials had been paid off to look the other way. Proof that the cartel had infiltrated law enforcement, the military, and even the intelligence agencies. Ethan plugged the USB into his laptop. The first file was a ledger. His eyes scanned the screen. Names, transactions, payments. And then he saw it. One name that made his blood run cold. Major William Carter. Carter wasn't just protecting the cartel, he was working with them. A direct pipeline between the U.S. military and the Sinaloa cartel, ensuring that human trafficking operations continued without interference. The government wasn't failing to stop the cartel. They were helping them. Ethan clenched his jaw. This was bigger than he thought. And if he wanted real justice, he was going to have to burn everything down. Ethan pulled out his burner phone and dialed. A voice answered on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." Ethan recognized the voice immediately. Nikolai Petrov, a former Russian Spetsnaz operative, now a mercenary with no allegiance except to the highest bidder. Ethan had worked with him years ago, in places where morality was nothing but a myth. "I need weapons," Ethan said, "and I need bodies, people who aren't afraid to put a bullet in some government scumbags." There was a pause, then Nikolai chuckled. "Oh, Cole, you're finally waking up." Ethan closed the laptop and stood up. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a pawn for the government. The system had failed him, failed Shadow, failed every victim who had ever suffered under the cartel's hands. But he was done following orders. Now, he was the war. And every single corrupt official, every single cartel member, every single bastard who had allowed this to happen, they were all dead men walking. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. What happens when a man betrayed by his own country decides to take justice into his own hands? What happens when he stops fighting for rules and starts fighting for vengeance? Stay tuned. The real war is about to begin. There are two kinds of justice in this world. The one they sell you on TV, where the good guys win and the system works. And the real one. The kind written in blood, carved into the flesh of men who think they're untouchable. Guess which one I believe in now? Ethan Cole had spent his whole life fighting for something bigger than himself. Fighting for a flag, a mission, a purpose. But that was before they let Shadow die. Before they covered up a human trafficking ring so deep it infected the highest levels of government. Before he realized that justice wasn't real. Not unless you made it real. And Ethan was about to make it real. He sat alone in his rundown motel room, a dim bulb buzzing overhead. His hands were steady, calm, controlled. In front of him was a map, red X's marked across the country, tied to names that had once meant nothing to him. But now they were dead men walking. Major William Carter, corrupt Pentagon official, protected cartel operations for a price. Miguel El Carnicero Salazar, the cartel butcher, responsible for torturing and executing hundreds of trafficking victims. Colonel Richard Kane, Special Forces liaison, traded U.S. intelligence for cartel money. Senator James Holloway, the politician, took millions in bribes to keep anti-trafficking legislation from ever passing. These men weren't criminals in the eyes of the law, but in Ethan's eyes, they were monsters, and monsters deserve to burn. Carter was first, he never saw it coming. Ethan followed him for days, watching his routines, his security, his weaknesses. The man was untouchable on paper. The Pentagon protected him, the government shielded him. But Ethan wasn't a politician, he was a hunter. And hunters don't play by the rules. The night Carter died, he had just left a high-end club in D.C., stepping into his armored SUV. His driver opened the door. A second too late. Boom. The bullet hit Carter's skull before he even heard the shot. The exit wound exploded out the back of his head, painting the inside of the SUV red. The driver panicked, reaching for his gun, but Ethan was already gone. One shot, one kill, no hesitation. Carter was just the beginning. By the time news of Carter's assassination hit the media, Ethan was already in Mexico. If he wanted to tear the system down, he couldn't just kill the men in suits. He had to gut the cartel itself, and that started with Miguel El Carnicero Salazar. They called him the Butcher, because that's exactly what he did. If a trafficking victim tried to escape, he didn't just kill them, he flayed them alive. He carved messages into their bodies. He sent their severed heads back to their families as warnings. The Mexican government couldn't touch him. The FBI couldn't find him. But Ethan? Ethan didn't need a badge. Salazar operated out of a fortified hacienda deep in the mountains, surrounded by a small army of killers. Ethan wasn't stupid enough to go in alone, so he built an army of his own. Nikolai Petrov, ex-Russian Spetsnaz, a ghost in the battlefield. Alejandro Reyes, former Mexican federal officer. Cartel hunting was personal. Dante Briggs, black ops sniper, never missed, never spoke, just killed. They weren't heroes, they were men with nothing to lose. And that made them unstoppable. The first explosion ripped through the cartel's outer defenses just past midnight. The guards never stood a chance. Ethan moved like a shadow through the compound, his suppressed rifle spitting death in the dark. Pop, one down. Pop, another. Men screamed in confusion as gunfire erupted from every direction. By the time they realized they were being wiped out, it was too late. Salazar tried to run. Ethan hunted him down. He found the Butcher in his office, frantically loading a gold-plated pistol. Please, Salazar stammered. I can pay you. Ethan shot him in the kneecap. Salazar screamed, collapsing onto the floor. Ethan crouched down, his voice cold as death. How many did you kill? Salazar whimpered, blood pooling beneath him. Ethan pressed the barrel of his gun against the man's forehead. How many little girls did you carve up? How many families did you destroy? Salazar sobbed, his hands clutching at Ethan's vest. Mercy, he begged. Ethan pulled the trigger. The cartel butcher died screaming, and the world was better for it. By morning, the hacienda was ashes. The cartel had lost its most sadistic enforcer, and Ethan had just declared war. The news called it an act of terrorism. The government called it unfortunate. The cartel? They called it a message. And they got the message loud and clear. Ethan wasn't just killing traffickers, he was erasing them. One by one. And nothing, not the US government, not the Mexican army, not even the most powerful crime syndicates in the world, was going to stop him. There's a saying in war, if you're fighting hell, you better be willing to become the devil. Ethan Cole had fought hell his entire life, and now, he was the devil they feared. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. And every last corrupt politician, every cartel boss, every monster hiding behind a badge or a dollar sign, they were all next. What if I told you that human trafficking isn't a crime, that it isn't an accident, or the work of a few monsters hiding in the shadows? What if I told you it's a business? A billion-dollar industry, protected, funded, and run by the very people we trust. Ethan Cole had started a war. The death of Miguel El Carnicero Salazar sent shockwaves through the underworld. The cartel was in chaos. The government was in panic mode, but Ethan wasn't stopping. Because the real horror wasn't in the jungles of Mexico. It was in the skyscrapers of Washington. Ethan sat in the back of an unmarked SUV, staring at the abandoned oil refinery ahead. The place was a graveyard of steel and rust, forgotten by the world. But inside? Inside was the secret the government never wanted anyone to find. A black site, a human processing facility, run not by the cartel, but by the US government. The documents Ethan had stolen from Carter's laptop led him here. They called it Project Nightfall. It was bigger than the cartel, bigger than the government. It was global. A pipeline for human trafficking, disguised as an immigration detention center. Ethan and his team had seen horrors before, but nothing prepared them for this. They breached at midnight. No alarms, no guards, because no one expected them to come. Ethan moved like a ghost, his team sweeping through the corridors. And that's when they found it. Rows of cells, each one holding human beings reduced to numbers. Women drugged into submission, waiting to be shipped off to brothels across the world. Children in cages, sedated because they weren't meant to be sold alive. Men with their organs harvested, left to die in their own filth. This wasn't a prison. This was a slaughterhouse. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. This wasn't just a cartel operation. This was systemic, controlled, protected. Someone high up had authorized this, and they were going to pay. The evidence that no one will ever see. Ethan ripped open a filing cabinet, pulling out classified documents, shipping manifests, financial records, names of politicians, generals, billionaires, people who had profited from the suffering inside these walls, people who had signed off on these operations like they were business transactions, people who would never see a day in prison. Ethan's fingernails dug into the paper because he knew the truth. He could take this to the press, to Congress, and it wouldn't mean a damn thing, because they owned the media, because they owned the government, because justice didn't exist. Not for these people, not for Shadow, not for anyone, unless Ethan made it exist. The first explosion shattered the silence, then another, and another. By the time the sun rose, the entire black site was gone, reduced to ashes and corpses. No survivors, no mercy, because monsters don't get trials, monsters get erased. 2 days later, the headlines ran a different story. Terrorist attack destroys immigration facility. They didn't call it a trafficking hub. They didn't mention the bodies inside. The victims weren't real to them. But Ethan knew. And he wasn't done. Because every man who signed those documents, every man who had let this happen, they were next. How do you fight a system designed to protect monsters? How do you wage war when the enemy owns the battlefield? When the government, the media, the law are all in on it? You stop fighting by their rules, and you burn them from the inside out. Ethan Cole wasn't just a man on a mission anymore. He was a ghost, a nightmare whispered in the halls of power. The media called him a terrorist. The government called him a traitor. The cartel called him the devil. But the victims, the ones no one cared about, they called him the reckoning, and he was just getting started. The men who thought they were untouchable. The black site was gone, reduced to ashes, its secrets buried beneath the rubble. But the men who built it still walked free. Ethan had their names, and now he was going to make them suffer. Target number 1, Senator James Holloway. A smiling politician, a man who gave speeches about human rights, shook hands with world leaders, a man who, behind closed doors, signed the documents that kept the trafficking pipelines open. He thought he was untouchable, but Ethan was about to prove him wrong. Holloway was hosting a fundraiser in New York City, a room full of billionaires, CEOs, and corrupt officials, all raising money for the very system Ethan had sworn to burn down. He wasn't about to storm in guns blazing. No, that would be too easy. He was going to make a statement. The Hunt, 8:45 p.m. Holloway's limousine rolled out of the hotel, headed for his penthouse. His security detail was tight, bulletproof glass, reinforced armor, a convoy of SUVs filled with ex-military contractors. They thought they were prepared, but they weren't ready for Ethan, because Ethan wasn't going to attack them. He was already inside. Holloway leaned back in his seat, sipping on a $10,000 bottle of whiskey. To him, life was good. He had power, connections, immunity. Nothing could touch him. Then his chauffeur spoke. But it wasn't his chauffeur's voice, it was Ethan's. "Senator." Holloway's blood ran cold. He turned, eyes wide with panic, and saw Ethan sitting in the front seat, gun resting on the dashboard. The original driver, lying dead in the trunk. Holloway's hands shook. Do you know who I am?" he stammered. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you're a dead man." They found Holloway's body the next morning, hanging from a bridge in downtown Manhattan. His mouth stuffed with $100 bills, and next to him, a USB drive. A drive containing every piece of evidence, every bribe, every order he had ever signed. The truth was out, and the media had no choice but to cover it. The world watched in horror, in rage, and for the first time, they saw what real justice looked like. The message was clear. The cartel was in hiding, the government was in panic mode, the elite were afraid, and Ethan, he was just getting started. Because Holloway had been the smallest name on the list, the real monsters were still out there. And Ethan was coming for every single one. When you rip the mask off power, when you show the world who really runs it, you don't just start a war, you start a revolution. And revolutions don't end until the last liar swings. Ethan Cole had done the unthinkable. He hadn't just killed a corrupt U.S. senator, he had exposed him. Holloway's dead body, dangling from a bridge with cartel money stuffed in his mouth, wasn't just a message. It was a declaration of war. And the people who thought they were untouchable, they were next. The media exploded. Every news station, every social media platform was flooded with headlines. Senator Holloway assassinated. Who is behind the killing? Leaked documents reveal government ties to human trafficking. Cartels, politicians, and corporate elites, a global conspiracy? The FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, they were all scrambling, not just to find Ethan, but to bury the truth. Because Holloway was just one name on the list. There were dozens more. And if the public knew just how deep the rot went, the entire system would collapse. They couldn't ignore him anymore. They had tried calling him a terrorist. They had tried burying his story. But now they had no choice. The President of the United States went on national television. His face was calm, cold, rehearsed. "We are facing a national crisis," he said. "A dangerous radical, responsible for multiple assassinations and acts of terrorism, is threatening the security of this country." Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the broadcast from a safe house deep in the mountains. "We will find him," the president continued, "and we will bring him to justice." Ethan smirked. Justice? They didn't even know the meaning of the word. The next name on the list? Colonel Richard Kane, a high-ranking U.S. military official, a man who had coordinated Black Ops missions for years. Except his missions weren't about national security. They were about moving people. Human trafficking disguised as classified military operations. He had signed the orders that sent entire families into cartel hands, and he had done it for money, for millions. Ethan had spent weeks tracking him, and now it was time. Kane was having dinner at a 5-star restaurant in D.C., surrounded by high-ranking military officials, billionaires, and corporate executives. They laughed. They clinked their glasses together, celebrating another deal. Ethan walked in unnoticed, dressed like a businessman, wearing a tailored suit. He sat 2 tables away, sipping a glass of whiskey. He waited, and when the waiter brought Kane's steak to the table, Ethan stood up. He walked over calmly. Kane's security moved to stop him. Too slow. Ethan pulled a silenced pistol from his jacket and shot Kane in the face, point blank. The restaurant erupted in screams. Blood splattered across the table, dripping onto the white linen. Kane's lifeless body slumped back into his chair. His wine glass tipped over, red liquid spilling like blood. Ethan turned to the terrified crowd. His voice was calm, cold, final. "This is what happens to men who sell human lives." And then he vanished into the night. The government was in full panic mode. Ethan wasn't just hunting cartel bosses anymore. He was executing U.S. officials in broad daylight. And the people? They weren't afraid. They were angry. Protests exploded across the country. The media couldn't contain it anymore. The government was losing control. And Ethan? He was winning. There were still names on the list, still monsters walking free. And the biggest name of all? The man at the top. The one who had funded everything. The one who had built the system. The one Ethan was saving for last. Final chapter, Justice, written in blood. They called me a terrorist, a murderer, a traitor. But I wasn't any of those things. I was something much worse. I was the truth they feared. And the truth doesn't die. It just waits in the dark. Ethan Cole had done the impossible. The system that protected monsters had been shaken to its core. Politicians were dead, generals were exposed, cartels were crumbling, and yet, nothing changed. The media tried to erase him, the government hunted him like a rabid dog, and the people, they screamed for more. Because Ethan hadn't just started a war, he had started a revolution. There was one final target, one last monster. Not a politician, not a cartel boss, not some billionaire hiding behind a fortress of lawyers. This was personal. His name was Gabriel de la Cruz, a high-ranking trafficker, a man who had built his fortune on suffering, the last person who saw Shadow alive. Ethan didn't just want him dead, he wanted him to suffer. De la Cruz thought he was safe. He had fled to a hidden compound deep in the jungles of Guatemala, surrounded by mercenaries, security drones, electrified fences. But Ethan had spent his whole life hunting men like him. Nothing could protect him now. The assault came at midnight. The power grid failed. Explosions ripped through the compound. Gunfire tore through the night. Ethan moved like a shadow, silent, relentless. Every guard who crossed his path fell without a sound. And when he finally found de la Cruz, The trafficker was on his knees, shaking, blood on his hands, the blood of thousands. Ethan raised his gun, and for the first time, De La Cruz begged, "Please, I have money. I have." Ethan pulled the trigger. One shot, right between the eyes, and just like that, the last monster fell. The world erupted. News of De La Cruz's execution spread like wildfire. The cartels were collapsing. The government was in chaos. Ethan Cole had become more than a name. He was a symbol, a legend, a ghost that haunted every corrupt man still breathing. And yet, his war wasn't over. Because for every monster he killed, there were 10 more waiting in the shadows. For every government official exposed, there was another one waiting to take their place. Justice was never permanent. It had to be delivered again and again. And Ethan? He was ready to keep delivering it. For Shadow, for the victims, for everyone who had been forgotten. Some say Ethan Cole vanished after that night, that he disappeared into the mountains, never to be seen again. Others say he's still out there, waiting, watching, a knife in the dark, a bullet in the chamber, a war that will never truly end, because monsters never stop, and neither does vengeance. The end, or just the beginning? What happens when the system refuses to change? What happens when the war never ends? What happens when the legend of a man becomes bigger than the man himself? Maybe Ethan is gone, or maybe he's just waiting for the next name on the list. Because as long as monsters exist, the Reaper will return, and justice will be written in blood.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.